Hello everyone and welcome back to the horror story. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep so before you drift off. I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed and let's the cabin in the woods. I needed a break and escape from the grind of everyday life, the constant barrage of notifications, meetings, and the endless noise of the city. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from town. It was the perfect spot to disconnect. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me and nature. The idea of spending a weekend alone sounded perfect time to clear my mind, away from everything that had been weighing me down. The cabin wasn't anything special. One room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. There was a porch out front with an old wooden chair that creaked with the slightest breeze. The view was nothing but endless trees stretching into the horizon, a thick, silent forest that seemed to swallow up all the noise in the world. I loved it immediately. No distractions, no demands, just peace. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was tranquil, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you aware of every breath, every movement. After unpacking, I started a small fire outside and heated a can of soup for dinner. By the time the last light of the day disappeared, the silence became overwhelming. I wasn't used to it. City life never offered this kind of stillness. That night, I sat on the porch, staring out into the dark forest. The fire crackled softly behind me, the only sound in an ocean of quiet. The darkness was thick, so thick, it felt like a wall just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet, and yet I kept staring, waiting for something to happen. Every so often I thought I heard the faintest rustling of leaves, maybe the movement of a small animal, but it could easily have been the wind. It had to be the wind. I didn't think much of it at first. I went to bed around midnight, though sleep didn't come easily. The bed was old, creaky, and every little noise outside seemed louder than it should have been. A branch scratching against the window, the wind rattling the loose shutters. It was unnerving. I kept telling myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, but it didn't stop my imagination from running wild. Then, around 2 a.m., a loud thud jolted me awake. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my ears straining to catch any sound. It had come from the side of the cabin. Something had hit the wall. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing at first, just silence. Then I heard it again, a soft crunch of leaves, this time closer to the window. I slid out of bed quietly, trying not to make any noise. My bare feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor as I approached the window. Peeking through the curtain, I saw nothing, just the same impenetrable darkness beyond the trees. No movement, no shadows. But I knew what I'd heard: footsteps. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, every muscle in my body tense, ready for something, anything. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, this time on the gravel path just outside the door. Deliberate, slow. I knew it wasn't an animal. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and switched it on. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't open the door. I stood there, flashlight in hand, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved to the side of the cabin, then to the back, as if someone was circling the place. My mind raced. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe someone needed help. But why not call out? The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound. There was nothing for several minutes, just the eerie silence of the forest. I didn't want to move. Didn't want to make a sound. My eyes darted to the door, my hand tightening around the flashlight. Then, another thud, this time from the back of the cabin. Something hit the wall again. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was out there. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight around. The beam barely reached past the edge of the porch, illuminating only a small patch of ground and trees. I didn't see anyone. No movement, no sign of life, but I knew what I'd heard. I stepped off the porch, flashlight trembling in my hand as I walked around the side of the cabin. The air was cold, biting against my skin. I scanned the area with the light moving slowly, trying to stay calm. There was nothing, just the stillness of the woods. I walked a few steps into the trees, shining the light between the trunks. Still nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just my nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. I started to feel foolish. I turned back toward the cabin, but just as I reached the porch, I heard it again, footsteps. This time, they were closer. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one. The beam of light fell on nothing but trees and shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow, panic bursts. I backed up onto the porch, my mind racing. Whoever it was, they were still out there, watching, waiting. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hand trembled as I turned off the flashlight and sat in the corner of the room, trying to calm down. But the footsteps started again, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, growing fainter, then louder as they passed by the windows. I sat there in the dark, huddled against the wall, waiting. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, never stopping, always moving, circling the cabin. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't trust it. I stayed there, listening, my breath shallow, my body tense, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I finally stood up. Every muscle in my body ached from sitting so still for so long. I cracked the door open and peered outside. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I packed my things quickly, not wasting any time. I wasn't staying there another night. As I made my way down the gravel path toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, hidden among the trees, just waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't stop to look back. I just got into my car and drove, leaving the cabin and its eerie silence behind. The lost woman on the trail. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a solo hike deep into the national park, far away from the chaos of daily life. It was a long weekend, and I wanted nothing more than to be alone in the wilderness, to clear my head and recharge. I'd planned everything down to the last detail, picking a remote trail that wound through dense forest and promised the kind of solitude I craved. I set off early, the sun barely rising over the trees as I laced up my boots and hit the trail. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. It was perfect. No people, no noise, just me and the forest. As the trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight in soft patches. It was beautiful, serene. About 3 hours in, I hadn't seen another soul. The trail was deserted, just as I had hoped. I stopped for a break, setting my backpack down on a rock and taking a long drink of water. That's when I saw her. She came stumbling up the trail from the direction I had just come. At first, I was surprised I hadn't expected to see anyone, especially not this far into the woods. But as she got closer, something about her seemed off. Her clothes were dirty, her hair tangled, and her eyes wide with panic. She wasn't carrying anything, no backpack, no water, nothing. "Hey," she called out, breathless as she reached me. "Can you help me? I'm lost." Her voice trembled, and I could see she was on the verge of tears. I stood up, unsure of what to say. It wasn't uncommon for people to get lost in the woods, but something about her didn't feel right. Still, I wasn't going to leave her out there alone. "Where did you come from?" I asked, looking around. There wasn't another trail for miles. "I don't know," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I've been walking for hours. I can't find my way back." Her story didn't make sense. How could she have been out here without any gear? No map, no phone, not even a jacket. But she looked terrified, and I didn't want to leave her in the woods, alone. "All right," I said, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. "Let's walk together. Maybe we can find our way back to the main trail." She nodded, falling in step beside me. But the longer we walked, the more uneasy I felt. She stayed close, crowding me on the narrow path. Every time I tried to make conversation, she gave vague answers or mumbled something I couldn't understand. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. We had been walking in circles. The same fallen tree we passed earlier was up ahead, the same split in the path that I had already taken. "Wait," I said, stopping in my tracks. "We've been here before. We're going the wrong way." She didn't respond at first, just stood there staring at me, her expression blank. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down my spine. "I think we should go back," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We'll head back to the main trail. There's a ranger station not far from here." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, she pointed down a narrow, overgrown path barely visible through the trees. "We need to go this way," she said, her voice cold. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why? What's down there?" She didn't answer. She just started walking toward the path, disappearing into the trees. I didn't follow. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there. Something was seriously wrong. I turned and started back down the trail, my pace quickening as I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. Behind me, I heard her footsteps slow at first, then faster, running after me. I ran. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I tore through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until the trail opened up into a clearing. I collapsed against a tree, my heart pounding in my ears, my legs trembling. When I finally looked back, she was gone. The forest was silent, the trail empty. I didn't waste any time. I ran the rest of the way back to the trailhead, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It felt too strange, too unreal. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back into those woods again. Story 3. The wrong house. It had been a long day at the office, the kind that leaves you drained and wishing for nothing more than the comfort of home. It was nearly midnight by the time I parked my car in front of the house. The quiet street, illuminated only by the dim street lamps and the occasional headlights from passing cars. The exhaustion was settling deep in my bones as I made my way up the driveway, keys jangling in my hand. When I reached the front door, I paused. Something was off, but in my tired state, it didn't register at first. My door, was slightly ajar, not wide open, but just enough to tell me it hadn't been closed all the way. For a moment, I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My wife had a habit of leaving the door unlocked if she knew I'd be home late, but she usually closed it. I shook off the creeping sense of unease. She probably just didn't pull the door shut hard enough. Figuring I'd remind her in the morning, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was dark, but that wasn't unusual. My wife would have gone to bed hours ago. I kicked off my shoes and tossed my keys onto the small table by the door. As I made my way toward the kitchen to grab a drink, the feeling returned. Something wasn't right. All right, the house was too still. Not the peaceful stillness of a quiet home, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that made my skin prickle. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, listening. There was no hum of the refrigerator, no creak of the house settling, just silence. I glanced toward the kitchen, and that's when I noticed the chairs. They were wrong. We had old wooden chairs around the kitchen table, worn from years of use, but the ones I was looking at now were sleek, metal, and completely unfamiliar. My stomach dropped. This wasn't my house. Panic flooded my mind, the reality of the situation hitting me all at once. I had walked into a stranger's house. The thought made my blood run cold. The houses in our neighborhood all looked the same, and I had been on autopilot, exhausted and not paying attention. But how had I not noticed? I had been living here for years. I knew my own home, didn't I? Heart pounding, I set the beer bottle I had just grabbed back onto the counter as quietly as I could. My only thought was to leave. Slowly, I turned toward the door, but before I could take a step, a voice cut through the silence. "Who the hell are you?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice came from the shadows of the hallway, low and dangerous. Slowly, I turned my head, and there, standing in the doorway, was a man. His face was half hidden in the dark, but I could see the shape of him clearly enough to know he was holding something, a bat or a club. My mouth went dry. I'm sorry, I stammered, raising my hand slightly to show I wasn't a threat. I thought this was my house. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glinted in the faint light from the street lamp outside. He didn't lower the bat. If anything, he gripped it tighter, his knuckles white. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. "You're in the wrong place, buddy," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. "I know," I said quickly, my hand still raised. "I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention. I'll leave right now." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me like he was trying to decide whether or not to believe me. My legs trembled, and I took a small step backward, inching closer to the door. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, slower this time, like he was giving me one last chance to explain myself. My mind raced. There was no explanation that would make this situation any less bizarre. I had walked into his house uninvited, and now I was trapped. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could get a word out, he lunged. I ducked, the bat swinging toward my head and missing by inches, crashing into the countertop with a loud crack. Instinct kicked in and I ran. I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy as he chased after me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door and yanked it open, stumbling out onto the porch and down the driveway. My legs were shaking so badly I almost fell, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath. Only then did I turn around to look. The man was standing in the doorway, bat in hand, watching me. He didn't follow me, didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran again, this time all the way back to my own house, my real house. When I got inside, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking, my legs weak. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. I checked the time. It was just after 1 a.m. My wife was asleep, completely unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. I didn't wake her. I didn't even tell her the next day. But now, every time I come home late, I double-check the address before I go inside. The night jogger. I've been jogging at night for as long as I can remember. I know it's not the safest habit, but it's the only time I feel alive. The air is cooler, the streets are quieter, and it's the only time I can clear my head. People always warn me to be careful, but I never thought much of it. I knew my usual route well, nothing had ever gone wrong. At least not until that night. Everything felt normal at first. I left the house just after sunset, laced up my shoes and hit the pavement. The sky was a deep purple, fading into black as the last bits of daylight disappeared. A few people were still out walking, couples on their evening strolls, a dog walker or two, but before long, the streets emptied. It was just me, the sound of my feet hitting the ground, and the night. I was about 2 miles in when I first noticed him. At first, he didn't seem out of place, just another person walking on the sidewalk, a little further behind me. It was quiet enough that I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his footsteps. I didn't think much of it. People walk around here all the time. But when I turned onto a smaller street, a quiet residential area with no shortcuts to anywhere, I noticed he was still behind me. That's when the knot of fear started to form in my stomach. I slowed down just to see what he'd do. His steps slowed too. Okay, maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just walking home at the same time and happened to be on the same path. That happens, right? I sped up again, picking up the pace, and sure enough, his steps quickened too. My heart started to pound, but I told myself not to panic. I was probably just overthinking it. Still, I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still there, a little closer now. I couldn't see his face clearly under the dim streetlights, but he was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with his head down like he didn't want to be noticed. But I noticed. I turned my head back around, my pulse racing. I told myself to stay calm, to think. He could just be walking home. There was no reason to panic, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. Something wasn't right. I turned down another side street, hoping he'd keep going straight, but he didn't. He turned with me. I didn't have to look to know he was following me now. His footsteps were still there, steady, matching mine step for step. I started running, my breath coming quicker now. My legs felt heavy, like I couldn't move fast enough, no matter how hard I tried. I darted around another corner, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced back, he was still there, closer than before. And he wasn't running, but his walk had turned into a fast stride, and I could feel him closing the distance between us. There were no cars passing by, no people out anymore. It was just me and him. I knew I couldn't outrun him. He was too close now. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in the pocket of my jacket, but pulling it out to call someone would slow me down, and I didn't have time. I could feel him gaining on me with every second. Up ahead, I saw a small alley between two buildings. It was risky, but I didn't have a choice. If I stayed on the street, I'd be out in the open with nowhere to go. If I took the alley, maybe I could lose him. Without thinking, I veered into the alley, sprinting as fast as I could. It was narrow, lined with dumpsters and shadows. My chest was burning, but I didn't stop. I could hear his footsteps echoing off the walls. Faster now, more urgent. He was coming after me. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt like I was going to collapse, but I kept running, pushing myself as hard as I could. The alley opened up into another street, and I burst out onto the sidewalk, glancing around desperately. There was still no one around. No cars, no lights in the windows. It was like the whole world had emptied out, leaving just me and him. I turned right, running down the sidewalk, but I knew I couldn't keep this pace much longer. My legs were shaking, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear him behind me, closer than ever. I was running out of options. Up ahead, I saw the entrance to a small park. The path through it was dark, lined with trees. If I could make it inside, maybe I could hide. Maybe he wouldn't follow me into the shadows. I veered off the street and into the park, my legs barely carrying me at this point. The path twisted and turned, disappearing into the trees, and I followed it blindly, not daring to look back. I reached a small cluster of trees and ducked behind them, pressing myself against the rough bark, trying to control my breathing. My heart was racing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep them still. I listened, straining to hear his footsteps, but there was nothing, just silence. Had I lost him? For a few minutes, I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I was too scared to even breathe, afraid he'd hear me. I kept telling myself I was safe, that he was gone. But then, I heard a twig snapping not far from where I was hiding. He was still out there. He was looking for me. I pressed myself harder against the tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear him moving now, slow, deliberate, like he was searching for something, for me. And May. I wanted to run, but I knew if I moved, he'd hear me. I was trapped. My mind raced trying to come up with a plan, but nothing seemed right. Every option felt like it would end with him catching me. Then, I heard his voice. "Come out," he called, his tone calm, almost playful. "I know you're here." My blood turned to ice. He knew. He knew exactly where I was. I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself from shaking. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay hidden. If he found me, I didn't know what he would do, but I knew it wouldn't be good. His footsteps were getting closer. He was right there, just on the other side of the trees. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come any closer, praying he wouldn't find me. And then, just when I thought I was done for, I heard something else, a car driving down the street nearby. Its headlights cut through the darkness, and for a moment, I saw him, a tall, shadowy figure standing just a few feet away from me. He hesitated, glancing toward the sound of the car, and in that split second, I made my move. I bolted up from behind the trees, sprinting toward the street. I didn't look back, didn't care if he saw me. I just ran. The car slowed as it passed, and I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The driver, a middle-aged man, stopped and rolled down his window, a concerned look on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. I glanced back, expecting to see the man chasing after me, but he was gone. The park was empty, the path disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know where he had gone, and I didn't care. I nodded, trying to catch my breath, my voice shaky as I spoke. "Yeah," I managed to say. "I'm okay." But I wasn't. I knew I'd never feel safe running at night again. The roommate with a knife. College life wasn't exactly what I had imagined. It was a lot lonelier, a lot quieter than I thought it would be. It didn't help that I'd moved into my dorm halfway through the semester, thanks to a housing mix-up at the start of the year. By the time I got my place, most people had already settled in, made friends, and established routines. The dorm room was cramped, typical of campus life. I didn't know much about my new roommate other than his name, Brady. He was already there when I arrived, his things neatly unpacked, his side of the room freakishly organized. He didn't say much when I introduced myself, just gave a quick nod and went back to folding his clothes with the precision of someone folding a flag. I figured we wouldn't need to be best friends, just civil enough to share the space. At first, it seemed like things would go smoothly. We passed each other with the usual pleasantries, a nod in the hall or a quick hey when we crossed paths. Brady had this habit of keeping his side of the room spotless, which was pretty much the opposite of how I lived. His clothes were always folded neatly, his books stacked by height, and even his shoes lined up in perfect alignment by the door. It was almost obsessive, but I couldn't really complain after all. It wasn't bothering me, not yet, at least. The weirdness started about a week after I moved in. I began noticing that Brady kept odd hours. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom or grab a drink of water, and there he'd be, sitting at his desk in the dark, whispering into his phone. He'd have it pressed so close to his ear that I could only make out muffled words. His face would be lit up by the glow of the screen, his eyes darting around the room like he was afraid someone might overhear him. It struck me as strange, but I figured it wasn't any of my business. Maybe he had a long-distance girlfriend or something. Still, it didn't sit right with me. Then there was the night I woke up around 3 a.m. and saw him just sitting on his bed, staring at his phone. He wasn't scrolling, wasn't texting, he was just staring at it, his face expressionless. The room was completely silent, but his eyes were glued to the screen like he was waiting for something. When I shifted in my bed, his head snapped up. He gave me this strange look, like he was surprised to see me there, like he had forgotten I even existed. Things got progressively stranger. Brady would disappear for days at a time without warning. No explanation, no heads up. One day he'd be there, the next day he'd be gone. I assumed he was going home for the weekend or staying with friends, but when I asked where he had been, he just shrugged and muttered something about being out and no details. No real answer. The tipping point came one Friday night. I was getting ready to go out with some friends when two guys I'd never seen before knocked on our door. They looked rough, definitely not the kind of people you'd want to mess with. They didn't say much, just asked if Brady was there. When I told them he wasn't, they exchanged a quick glance before the taller one nodded and said, "Tell him we came by. He knows what it's about." The whole thing left me feeling uneasy. When Brady came back later that night, I told him about the two guys and he just stared at me. His eyes went cold and he didn't say a word, just turned and walked to his side of the room without a response. After that, the tension between us thickened. It felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own room. Then there was the night I woke up to him standing over me. It was pitch dark, but I could make out his silhouette looming at the edge of my bed. My heart jumped into my throat. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light from the hallway, I realized he was holding something in his hand, a knife. I froze. He didn't move. Didn't say anything. He just stood there staring down at me, gripping the knife so tightly that his knuckles were white. My mind raced. Was he sleepwalking? Was this some kind of sick prank? I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? Should I run? For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, me lying frozen in bed, him standing over me with that knife. I couldn't even breathe. Then, slowly, he took a step back, then another. He lowered the knife, turned around, and walked back to his bed like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Brady was gone. His bed was made, his desk was cleared, but he had vanished. He didn't come back for 2 days. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I don't know why. Maybe I thought no one would believe me, or maybe I was just scared of what Brady might do if he found out I had told someone. When he finally came back, I started avoiding him as much as possible. I'd leave the room whenever he was there, stay out late at the library, or crash at a friend's place. But every night when I came back, he was there, sitting on his bed with that same blank look on his face, like nothing had ever happened. Then, one day, I came back to the room, and all of his stuff was gone. His bed was stripped, his clothes were packed, his desk was empty. He had just disappeared without a word. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. The housing office said he had moved out, but they didn't have any details. It was like he had never even existed. To this day, I don't know what he was planning that night. I don't know why he was standing over me with that knife, or what was going through his head, but I can still see the look in his eyes when I think about it. And I know that whatever was going on in his mind, it wasn't good. The parking garage encounter. It was a late Friday night, the kind of night that makes you question why you're still working long after everyone else has gone home. The office was practically deserted by the time I wrapped up, save for a few other overworked souls in the distant cubicles. I had stayed later than usual, trying to finish up a project before the weekend, and by the time I was done, the clock read just past 10 p.m. The office building was part of a larger complex with a parking garage attached right next to it. Convenient, but not exactly the safest place after dark. As the elevator descended to the garage level, I felt that uneasy stillness settle in a silence that didn't sit right with me. When the elevator doors opened with a soft ding, I stepped out into the dimly lit garage. The lights flickered, just like they always did. They'd been like that for months, and management had never bothered to fix them. I tried to brush off the creeping sense of paranoia. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was just playing tricks on me. But as I made my way to my car, that feeling gnawed at me, making my skin crawl. I was parked a few rows back from the elevator, and as I approached my car, I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The lights flashed briefly, the sound of the doors unlocking echoing through the empty garage. I quickened my pace, eager to get home and leave this unsettling feeling behind. But just as I reached my car, headlights appeared at the entrance to the garage. A van. It was white, unmarked, and rolled slowly into the garage, pulling into a spot just a few spaces away from me. My stomach clenched, but I told myself it was nothing. People parked here all the time. It wasn't unusual. The van stopped, and two men got out. They weren't dressed like office workers, no suits, no briefcases, just regular clothes, a bit scruffy, like they hadn't seen a laundry machine in a while. Both of them turned to look in my direction. One of them smiled, the kind of smile that makes you uneasy rather than reassured. "Hey, miss," one of them called out, his voice echoing in the empty garage. "Looks like you've got a flat tire there. Need some help?" I froze. I hadn't even checked my tires, but I knew there was nothing wrong with them. I always parked carefully, far from any debris. My mind raced, and I crouched down, pretending to inspect my tires. They were perfectly fine. "No, I think I'm good," I said, standing back up, trying to keep my voice calm. I smiled tightly, hoping it would end the conversation. But the two men didn't stop walking toward me. "Nah, you definitely got a flat," the second man chimed in. His grin was gone now, replaced by a look I didn't like. They were getting too close, and the distance between me and the elevator felt far too long. "We can help you fix it," the first man insisted. "Won't take long." My heart was pounding now. I could see the van's passenger door slightly open, something I hadn't noticed before. A cold realization hit me. They wanted me to get closer to the van. I took a step back, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. "I really appreciate it, but I'm fine." The second man's grin faded, and his eyes darkened. "Come on, we're just trying to help you out." I forced another smile, my back inching toward the front of my car. "No, really, I'm fine." That's when the first man reached out, his hand moving toward me, and I felt the panic surge in my chest. I had two options: run or make a scene. Without thinking, I took a step forward and raised my voice. I said, "No, back off." My voice echoed through the garage, louder than I had intended. The men stopped, surprised by my sudden outburst. For a brief moment, we all stood there in tense silence, the air thick with unspoken danger. Then, without another word, I spun around and bolted for the garage exit, my footsteps quickening with every step. I could hear their footsteps behind me fast, but not running. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the exit, I glanced over my shoulder. The men were standing by their van, watching me, their faces obscured by the shadows. They didn't follow me out, but the way they stood there, just watching, sent chills down my spine. It felt like a warning. Once outside, I hurried to a nearby well-lit street and flagged down a passing car, an older man behind the wheel. I didn't explain what had happened, just asked him to wait with me until my ride share arrived. The man looked concerned, but didn't ask too many questions. I reported the incident to the building's security the next day. They promised to check the cameras, maybe even patrol the garage more frequently, but I don't know if they ever did. I never saw those men again, but for days I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still hanging around, waiting for someone else. I haven't worked late since. If I ever do again, I'll make sure someone walks me to my car, the Airbnb host. I booked the cabin on a whim, hoping a weekend away from the chaos of the city would help me clear my head. The stress of work had been building up for months, and I was desperate for some peace and quiet. The Airbnb listing had good reviews, and the photos showed a cozy little cabin tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors for miles, exactly what I needed. The host, Mark, had been friendly enough over the app, responding quickly to my booking and providing detailed directions to the cabin. The place was about a 2-hour drive out of the city, far enough to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't turn back if I needed to. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was just as advertised: wood paneling, a small fireplace, large windows that overlooked the trees. It felt private, secluded, almost idyllic. Mark had even left a little welcome note on the kitchen table with his contact information in case I needed anything. The gesture seemed thoughtful at first. The first night was perfect. I made a simple dinner, had a glass of wine, and curled up by the fireplace with a book. The quiet was calming. a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. By the time I went to bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The next morning, around 10 a.m., I was just finishing my coffee when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so the sound caught me off guard. I set down my mug and walked over to the door, opening it to find Mark standing on the porch with a friendly smile. "Hey there," he said. "Just thought I'd swing by, see how you're settling in." His presence surprised me. I hadn't expected the host to drop by in person, especially not unannounced. Still, I figured he was just being courteous, checking in on his guest. "Everything's great," I said, trying to sound polite despite my confusion. "The place is lovely." Mark nodded but didn't leave. He glanced past me into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room behind me. "Mind if I pop in for a second? I want to check on something real quick." The request was odd, but I didn't want to seem rude. After all, he owned the place, and maybe he needed to check something for maintenance. Sure, I said, stepping aside. Mark walked in and started wandering around, not really looking at anything in particular. He glanced at the fireplace, then the kitchen, and even walked down the short hallway toward the bedroom. I stood there, waiting, feeling awkward. "Everything okay?" I asked after a few minutes. "Oh yeah," he said, flashing me that same smile. "Just making sure everything's in working order. We gotta keep the place in tip-top shape for guests, you know." I nodded, but something about the visit didn't sit right with me. After another few minutes, Mark finally left. I shrugged it off, convincing myself he was just being thorough. I wasn't used to staying in a stranger's cabin, so maybe this was normal. The rest of the day was uneventful. I went for a walk in the woods, read a bit more, and tried to relax. I managed to put this strange visit out of my mind, telling myself that it was over and that Mark wouldn't be coming back. But that evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard another knock at the door. I froze. My stomach knotted with unease as I walked to the door and opened it. Sure enough, Mark was standing there again, that same friendly smile plastered on his face. "Hey," he said. "I forgot to check the water heater earlier. Do you mind if I take a quick look?" I stared at him, my unease growing by the second. Why was he here again? The water heater had been working fine, as far as I could tell. "Is something wrong with it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh no, nothing's wrong," Mark said, already stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Just routine maintenance." This time I followed him closely, watching as he wandered around the cabin once more. He didn't go to the water heater right away. Instead, he started poking around again, looking at things that didn't need to be checked, opening cupboards, glancing out the windows. Every second he stayed, my discomfort grew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he opened the closet where the water heater was stored, glanced at it for all of 5 seconds, then turned back to me with that same unsettling smile. "All good here," he said. "I'll let you get back to your evening." He left without another word, and as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, I locked it. I sat down on the couch, my heart pounding. There was something off about Mark, something that made my skin crawl. Why had he come back again? Why was he so interested in the cabin when nothing was wrong? The longer I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. That night, I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump: the wind in the trees, the creaking of the cabin as it settled. Everything seemed amplified in the dark silence of the woods. Then, around midnight, I heard it again, a knock at the door. This time, I didn't move. I stayed in bed, my heart racing. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to see Mark standing there again. The knocking didn't stop. It was steady, slow, like whoever was on the other side knew I was awake and was just waiting for me to answer. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window by the door, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. It was Mark. Mark. He was standing on the porch, his face half hidden in the shadows. This time, he wasn't smiling. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the window, clutching my phone. Should I call the police? What would I even say? Mark hadn't done anything illegal. He was just there, too often. The knocking stopped, but I didn't feel any better. I spent the rest of the night pacing, checking the windows, listening for any sound outside. I was too scared to sleep, too paranoid to relax. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I made up my mind. I wasn't staying here another night. I packed my things in record time, barely thinking about anything other than getting out of there as fast as I could. As I loaded my bags into the car, I glanced toward the edge of the woods. Mark was standing there, watching me. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, arms at his sides, his expression blank and cold. I didn't look back after that. I threw my bags in the car, started the engine, and peeled out of there, driving down the winding dirt road as fast as I could. On the way home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mark's truck following me, but it never appeared. I didn't leave a review for the Airbnb. I didn't report what had happened. I just wanted to forget about it, to pretend it never happened. The hitchhiker. It had been a long shift at the diner, and by the time I got off work, it was well past midnight. The drive home wasn't supposed to be long, just a stretch of highway through the middle of nowhere. A few exits, and then home. I was exhausted, my body aching from hours of waitressing, and all I wanted to do was crawl into bed. Halfway through the drive, my car started sputtering. I glanced down at the dashboard, praying that the engine would hold out until I got off the highway, but the car started losing power fast, and no matter how hard I pressed the gas pedal, it wouldn't pick up speed. I managed to pull over to the side of the road just as the engine died completely. There were no streetlights, no cars in sight, just me, my dead car, and miles of darkness stretching out on either side. I tried restarting the engine, but it wouldn't even turn over, just a hollow click. My heart sank. I wasn't great with cars, but I knew enough to realize I was stuck. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help, but of course there was no signal. I was too far out. I should have taken the longer route with better service, but I hadn't wanted to waste any more time getting home. Now I was stranded on a deserted highway with no way to call anyone. For a while I just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel and hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would drive by and offer to help. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the reality of the situation settled in. I was alone. The wind howled outside, rustling the leaves on the trees, and every sound made my heart race. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something or someone was watching me from the darkness. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw headlights approaching. A wave of relief washed over me as I stepped out of the car and waved my arms to get the driver's attention. The car, beat-up old pickup truck, slowed down and pulled over in front of me. A man got out. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes, but he smiled as he approached, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It just died on me. No signal out here, either." The man nodded, glancing at my car before turning back to me. "I can give you a ride, if you need. Closest town's about 10 miles that way." I hesitated. It was late. I didn't know this guy didn't know where he was from or where he was going, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here all night, stranded on the side of the road. I forced a smile. "That would be great, thanks." He led me to his truck, opening the passenger door for me. I climbed in, my hands shaking slightly as I buckled my seatbelt. The inside of the truck smelled like gasoline and old leather, but I tried not to think about it. The man got in on the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. For a few minutes, we drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Then he spoke. "So, what were you doing out here so late?" I glanced at him, his face half lit by the dashboard lights. "Just coming home from work. I didn't expect my car to break down." He nodded, but didn't say anything else. The silence stretched on, and the further we drove, the more I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "There's a gas station a few miles up," he said. "I'll drop you there. They can help you out." But the longer we drove, the more I noticed something strange. We had passed an exit a few minutes ago, and now we were driving deeper into the woods, the road narrowing, the trees closing in on either side. This wasn't the way to the gas station. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we were heading the wrong way. "Are you sure this is the right direction?" I asked, my voice tight with panic. The man didn't answer right away. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Then he smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I'm sure." The creepy neighbor. Moving into my first home was supposed to be a milestone and new chapter in life filled with independence and peace. It wasn't a big house, just a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode bikes in the streets until dusk. It felt like the perfect spot to start fresh. The first few weeks were uneventful, exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my time settling in, decorating, and getting used to the quiet rhythm of suburban life. I'd see my neighbors, occasionally an elderly couple across the street, who waved politely, a young family a few houses down. Everyone seemed friendly enough, but no one stood out. Until I met Craig. Craig lived directly across the street. He was in his mid-40s, a quiet, stocky man with short-cropped hair and an ever-present baseball cap. I had seen him a few times, mowing his lawn or sitting on his porch, but we hadn't spoken. One evening, as I was unloading groceries from my car, he waved and walked over. "Hey there," he said, offering a small, crooked smile. "You're new to the neighborhood." "Ha." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just moved in a few weeks ago." Craig nodded, his eyes scanning my house, lingering on the windows for a beat too long. "Nice place. Quiet around here. You'll like it." "Thanks," I said, a bit uncomfortable with the way he was looking at my home. "Need any help with anything?" "I'm pretty handy," he added, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone that unsettled me. It felt more like an offer I couldn't refuse than a friendly gesture. "No, I'm all set, but thanks," I said, trying to be polite but firm. Craig didn't push the offer. He just nodded, gave me that same crooked smile, and walked back across the street. I shrugged it off, chalking up my discomfort to my natural shyness around strangers. Over the next few days, I started noticing Craig more often. He was always outside sitting on his porch, mowing the lawn, or just standing in his driveway. At first, I thought nothing of it. People spend time in their yards all the time, right? But after a while, it became clear that Craig wasn't just outside, he was watching me. Every time I stepped outside, he was there, his eyes tracking my movements. Whether I was getting the mail, taking out the trash, or leaving for work, Craig was always on his porch, staring. Sometimes he'd wave or call out a greeting, but more often than not, he just stood there in silence, watching. At night, I'd catch glimpses of him through my blinds, standing in his driveway or on his porch, facing my house. The sight of him there, bathed in the dim light of the street lamps, sent a chill down my spine. His silhouette, motionless and unnerving, made me feel like I was never truly alone. I started keeping my blinds closed all the time, locking the doors even during the day. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I was being hunted, like Craig was always waiting for the right moment to make his move. One evening, I was curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie, when I heard a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat. It was too late for anyone to be dropping by unannounced. I glanced at the clock, 11:15 p.m. I tiptoed to the front door and peered through the peephole. It was Craig. He stood on my porch, his hands in his pockets, his face hidden under the brim of his baseball cap. My pulse quickened. Why was he here? What did he want? I didn't answer. After a moment, he knocked again, louder this time. "Hey, it's Craig, just checking in. Thought you might need something." My mouth went dry. What could he possibly want this late at night? I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I didn't dare make a sound. Eventually, after a few more minutes of silence, I heard his footsteps retreating from the porch. I waited, listening, until I was sure he was gone. The next morning, I found something strange in my mailbox, a note folded neatly and addressed to me with no return address. Inside, in small, neat handwriting, was a message that made my skin crawl. "Nice to see you home safe. C. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. How had he known when I got home? I had been careful, avoiding him, taking different routes to my house. But somehow, Craig knew. He had been watching. I decided then that I needed to confront him. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder. So that afternoon, I walked across the street and knocked on Craig's door. He answered almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Hey there," he said, smiling that crooked smile. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated, my heart racing. "I got your note. I don't appreciate you watching me all the time. It's making me uncomfortable." Craig's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm just being neighborly," he said, his voice low and measured. "Looking out for you. It's a dangerous world out there. You never know who might be watching." His words sent a chill down my spine. "I don't need you to look out for me," I said, my voice shaking. "Please, just leave me alone." For a moment, Craig said nothing. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, unsettling eyes. Then, slowly, he smiled again. "Sure thing," he said. "Whatever you say." I turned and walked back to my house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't trust him. I didn't believe for a second that he would stop. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, footsteps crunching in the yard. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't dare look. I just lay there, wide-eyed in the dark, praying that it would stop. Eventually it did, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening, terrified that Craig was still out there, waiting for the right moment. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't care if it was paranoid. I wasn't going to stay in a house where I felt like prey. I haven't been back since. The photographer. Traveling had always been my escape. I loved exploring new places, getting lost in unfamiliar cities, immersing myself in different cultures. My solo trip to Vienna was supposed to be just another adventure, another mark on my growing list of cities to visit. It had started out perfectly. The city was beautiful, filled with stunning architecture, rich history, and friendly locals. I spent my days wandering the cobbled streets, visiting museums and sampling pastries at cozy little cafes. I felt free, unburdened by the responsibilities of everyday life. But on my second day, I noticed something strange. I was sitting at an outdoor cafe, sipping a cappuccino and watching the people pass by when I saw him. A man standing across the street with a camera in his hands. At first, I didn't think anything of it. After all, it was Vienna. Tourists were everywhere, snapping pictures of the beautiful scenery. But as I glanced up from my coffee, I realized the man wasn't photographing the buildings or the streets. His camera was pointed directly at me. My heart skipped a beat. I looked away quickly, pretending not to notice, but my mind raced. Maybe he had just been taking a picture of the cafe, I told myself. Or maybe he was a street photographer capturing candid moments of people enjoying the city. But when I glanced up again, he was still there, his camera lens trained on me. I gathered my things and left the cafe, walking quickly down the street, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as I turned the corner, I glanced back. He was following me. I felt a chill run down my spine. My pace quickened, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. I weaved through the crowded streets, trying to lose him in the throngs of tourists. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, keeping his distance but never losing sight of me. By the time I reached my hotel, I was practically running. I darted inside, my heart racing, and hurried up to my room. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed, trying to catch my breath. Maybe it was nothing, I thought. Maybe he just happened to be going in the same direction, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside the hotel, too shaken to venture back out into the city. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overreacting. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, I tried to put the incident behind me. I had come to Vienna to enjoy myself, not to be scared into hiding. I forced myself to go out to explore the city as I had planned, but everywhere I went, I felt his presence. At the museum, I saw him standing near the entrance, his camera hanging around his neck. At the park, he was sitting on a bench, pretending to read a newspaper but glancing up at me every few seconds. Even at the crowded market, I caught sight of him in the distance, watching. By the third day, I was a wreck. I didn't want to leave my hotel room, but staying locked inside felt just as dangerous. I couldn't explain it, but the way he followed me, the way he watched me, it felt more than just strange. It felt predatory. I tried to take different routes to lose him in the crowds, but he was always there. No matter how many turns I took or how fast I walked, he found me. On my last night in Vienna, I made a decision. I was leaving early. My flight wasn't scheduled until the next afternoon, but I couldn't stand the thought of spending another minute in the city, knowing he was out there, watching. I packed my bags in a hurry and booked a new flight for the following morning, early enough that I could slip out of the hotel before anyone noticed. The next morning, just as the first light of dawn broke over the city, I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the lobby. I was almost at the front door when the receptionist called out to me. "Miss, you have a package." I stopped, confused. A package? For me. "Yes," she said, handing me a small envelope. "It was left here last night." I stared at the envelope, my heart pounding. There was no name on it, no return address, just my hotel room number scrawled on the front in neat handwriting. I ripped it open, my hands trembling. Inside was a single photograph. It was of me, sitting at the cafe on my first day in Vienna. The date and time were printed at the bottom, along with a handwritten note. "See you soon." I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I left the hotel without looking back. The stranger on the hiking trail. I've always loved hiking. The peace, the solitude, the quiet rhythm of nature, it's the perfect way to clear my mind and escape the stress of everyday life. So when I found a new trail deep in the forest about an hour from my house, I couldn't wait to check it out. The trail was part of a nature reserve, tucked away in the hills, far from any towns or highways. It promised stunning views and, best of all, solitude. I packed a lunch, grabbed my gear, and set off early in the morning, eager to get on the trail before the sun got too hot. The drive was uneventful, just a long stretch of winding roads surrounded by thick trees. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, there were only a few cars in the parking lot, and I hadn't seen another person for miles. It was perfect. The trail started out easy, winding gently through the forest. The trees thick and lush, casting cool shadows over the path. Birds chirped overhead, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound around. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. About an hour into the hike, I reached a clearing where the trail forked in two directions. To the right, the path continued uphill, disappearing into the trees. To the left, a smaller, overgrown trail veered off into the woods. I knew from the map that the right path was the main trail, but something about the overgrown path intrigued me. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. The smaller path wasn't marked, and it didn't look well traveled, but the explorer in me couldn't resist. Maybe it led to a hidden waterfall or a scenic overlook that wasn't on the map. I decided to take a chance and follow it. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The trees grew denser, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows over the trail. The air felt heavier, cooler, as if I had stepped into another world entirely. After about 20 minutes, I started to wonder if I should turn back. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and there were no signs or markers to indicate where it led. I hadn't seen anyone else since I left the main trail, and the solitude that had felt so peaceful earlier now felt ominous. I paused to take a sip of water, glancing back the way I'd come when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel rustling in the bushes. But then the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, like someone walking toward me. I turned around, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the forest. No answer. I waited, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. My heart began to race. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the knot of anxiety in my stomach wouldn't go away. I decided it was time to turn back. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows darker, more menacing. My pace quickened, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I just wanted to get back to the main trail. And then I saw him. He was standing on the path ahead, partially hidden by the trees. A man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest. Where had he come from? How had I not heard him approaching? I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "Are you lost? Are you lost?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on me, his face hidden in the shadows. I took a step back, my pulse racing. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. He wasn't another hiker. He didn't have any gear, no backpack, no water. He was just there. "I'm headed back to the main trail," I said, my voice trembling. "It's just back this way." Still, the man said nothing. He didn't move, didn't even blink. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and started walking, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me as I moved, but I didn't dare look back. I kept walking faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. When I finally reached the fork where the overgrown trail met the main path, I stopped and glanced over my shoulder. The man was gone. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, my mind racing. Had he been real, or had I imagined him, conjured up by the isolation and the eerie silence of the forest? I didn't wait to find out. I hurried back to the parking lot, my footsteps quick and uneven. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking, and I couldn't get the door unlocked fast enough. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. I've gone on plenty of hikes since then, but I've never returned to that trail. Something about that man, something about the way he watched me still haunts me. I don't think I was supposed to find that path. The interrupted road trip. Road trips are supposed to be fun, right? That's what I kept telling myself as I loaded up my car and set off on a long solo drive across the country. I had planned the route meticulously, mapping out rest stops, diners, and motels along the way. I was excited for the adventure, the freedom of the open road. It was supposed to be a 2-day drive to my destination, but somewhere along the way, I made a wrong turn. I'm still not sure where I went wrong. One minute, I was cruising down the highway, music blasting, the sun setting behind me. The next, I found myself on a narrow, deserted back road with no streetlights and no signs. I tried not to panic. After all, I had GPS on my phone and I wasn't far from the next town. But when I pulled out my phone to check my location, I realized I had no signal. Nothing. No bars, no internet, just the empty screen of my map app trying and failing to load. I took a deep breath and kept driving. The road was winding and dark, the trees on either side thick and looming, casting long shadows over the asphalt. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the longer I drove, the more I started to feel like I was heading in the wrong direction. After another 20 minutes, I spotted a small gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. Relief washed over me. I could stop, ask for directions, maybe use a landline to call someone. Anything to get me back on track. I pulled into the station, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place looked run down, like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The lights were dim, and there was no one in sight. Still, it was my only option. I stepped out of the car, the air cool and still. A faint breeze rustled the trees, but otherwise everything was quiet, too quiet. As I approached the door to the station, it creaked open, and an old man stepped out. He was thin, hunched over, with a grizzled beard and a tattered jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His eyes were small and sharp, glinting in the dim light as he looked me up and down. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. Could you tell me how to get back to the highway?" The old man stared at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Sure, highway's about 30 miles back that way," he said, pointing down the road, "but you won't get there tonight." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Road's been closed. Storm washed it out a few days ago," he said, his voice flat. I frowned. "But there's no storm. The weather's been clear." The old man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. The air around us felt heavy, thick with tension. My skin prickled with unease. "Well, is there another way around?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man's lips curled into a thin smile. "There's always another way," he said slowly, "but you won't want to take it. Best stay here for the night." I glanced around. The gas station was old and run down, and I had no interest in staying there, but something about the man's words sent a shiver down my spine. "I think I'll try to find another route," I said quickly, backing toward my car. "Thanks for the advice." The old man didn't move. He just watched me, his smile fading as I turned and hurried back to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't like the way he had looked at me, the way his words hung in the air like a warning. As I pulled out of the gas station and back onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old man was still standing there, watching me. His figure grew smaller and smaller as I drove away, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a shadow. I drove for another hour, searching for a way back to the highway, but the road only grew narrower, darker. My headlights cut through the thick blackness, but there were no signs, no landmarks, just endless trees and the suffocating silence of the night. Then, in the distance, I saw another pair of headlights approaching. Relief flooded through me. Maybe I could follow this car back to the main road, or at least flag them down and ask for directions. But as the car drew closer, something about it felt off. It wasn't just one car. It was the same car. My heart skipped a beat. The headlights were identical to mine, and the shape of the car was unmistakable. As it passed me, I glanced out the window, and my stomach dropped. It was my car. I stared at it, wide-eyed, as it drove by, the driver's face hidden in the shadows. It looked exactly like my car, same model, same color, same everything. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. I sat there, heart racing, staring at the rearview mirror as the taillights of the other car disappeared into the distance. How was that possible? I looked down at my phone, desperate for a signal. Still nothing. I didn't know where I was, how I had gotten here, or what I had just seen. All I knew was that I needed to get off this road. I turned the car around and headed back the way I'd come, back toward the gas station, back toward the old man. I didn't care how strange it was, I just wanted to get out of there. But when I reached the gas station, it was gone. The lot was empty, the lights were off, and there was no sign of the old man or the rundown station that had been there just an hour ago. I sped out of there, my heart pounding, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a motel and locked myself in a room for the rest of the night. The next morning, I got back on the highway and finished my trip. But I'll never forget that night on the back road, and I'll never understand what really happened. The woman on the bus. I don't usually take the bus at night. There's something unsettling about public transportation after dark, the way the fluorescent lights flicker, the empty seats, the eerie silence except for the hum of the engine. But my car was in the shop, and I had no other option. I figured it was just one night, just one ride, and I'd be home in no time. It was late, well past 11 p.m. when I boarded the bus. The streets were quiet, the city winding down for the night. I slid into a seat near the back, pulling out my headphones in an attempt to drown out the silence. Only a few other passengers were scattered throughout the bus, each lost in their own world. A man in a business suit dozed off near the front. A young couple whispered to each other a few rows ahead of me, and an elderly woman sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. For the first part of the ride, everything was normal. The bus stopped occasionally to let people on and off, the lights of the city flickering by as we moved deeper into the night. I closed my eyes, letting the soft rhythm of the bus lull me into a daze, my music providing a comforting backdrop. But somewhere along the route, I felt that strange, uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes and glanced around the bus. The man in the suit was still asleep. The couple was still quietly chatting, and the elderly woman was still staring out the window. No one was paying any attention to me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. I closed my eyes again, but the sensation grew stronger. There was a weight to it, like eyes boring into the back of my head, prickling my skin. I shifted in my seat and glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting in the very last row, directly behind me. I hadn't noticed her when I first got on the bus, and I couldn't remember seeing her at any of the stops. She was younger than I expected, probably in her early 20s, with long, dark hair that hung down over her face, obscuring her features. Her clothes were old and tattered, hanging off her like they didn't quite fit, but it was her eyes that caught me. She was staring at me, unblinking, her gaze intense and unsettling. I forced a smile, hoping to diffuse the strange tension between us, but she didn't react. She didn't move at all, just stared. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back around, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. Maybe she was just zoning out, lost in her own thoughts. People did that on buses all the time, right? There was no reason to be scared. But as the bus continued on, the feeling didn't go away. I could still feel her eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around again, hoping to catch her off guard to see if she was really staring at me or if I was just being paranoid. But when I looked, the seat was empty. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The girl was gone. I hadn't heard her move, hadn't heard her get up or walk down the aisle. She had just disappeared. My pulse quickened, and I glanced around the bus. The man in the suit was still asleep. The couple was still whispering to each other. The elderly woman was still staring out the window, completely unaware of what was happening. I turned back around, my heart pounding. Maybe she had gotten off at one of the stops. Maybe I just hadn't noticed, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. For the rest of the ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bus was too quiet, too still, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the seats, every hiss of the brakes made me jump, my mind racing with possibilities. Finally, my stop approached, and I stood up, eager to get off the bus and away from the oppressive atmosphere. But as I made my way toward the doors, I felt a presence behind me, someone close, too close. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know who or what was following me. The bus doors hissed open, and I practically ran down the steps, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, breathing heavily, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one had followed me off the bus. When I finally looked back, the bus was pulling away, disappearing into the night. I never saw the girl again, but every time I take the bus at night, I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, watching from the last row. The stormy night call. It was a stormy night, the kind that rattled the windows and sent the wind howling through the trees. I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a mug of tea, trying to enjoy the coziness of being indoors while the storm raged outside. The power had flickered a few times but hadn't gone out completely. The house was dimly lit by the warm glow of the living room lamp, and the sound of the rain pounding against the roof was almost soothing. Almost. But there was an edge to the storm that kept me on edge. The wind seemed to wail like it was trying to get inside, and the trees outside swayed violently, casting strange shadows across the walls. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book in my hands, but the sense of unease wouldn't go away. Then, the phone rang. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't my cell phone, but the old landline that I kept for emergencies. I didn't get many calls on it, almost none, actually, so the sudden ringing in the quiet house felt jarring. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the phone on the wall as it rang again. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling, the rain hammering against the windows. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello. There was silence on the other end. "Hello," I said again, my voice shaky. Still nothing. Just the faint crackle of static. I was about to hang up when I heard a voice, barely a whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it over the storm. "Help me." Oh, my blood ran cold. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Help me," the voice repeated, a little louder this time, but still barely audible over the crackling static. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tightened my grip on the phone. "Where are you? What's wrong?" There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought the line had gone dead. But then the voice spoke again, louder, more desperate. "Help me. They're coming." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming? Where are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. But the voice didn't answer. The static on the line grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the call went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. Who had that been? Was it a prank? Some kind of mistake? Or was someone really in danger? I hung up the phone and paced the living room, my thoughts swirling. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? I didn't know who had called or where they were. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, the phone rang again. I froze, my hand hovering over the receiver. My heart pounded in my chest, and I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before picking it up. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. This time, there was no voice. Just the sound of breathing slow, heavy, and deliberate. My skin prickled with fear. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaky. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried, as if whoever was on the other end had all the time in the world. I could feel the fear tightening around my chest, suffocating me. "Please, just tell me who you are," I whispered, my throat dry. And then, the line went dead again. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone was watching me, even though I was alone in the house. I quickly locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one as the storm outside continued to rage. The wind howled louder, and the rain beat against the roof, as if the storm itself was trying to get inside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch, wrapped in my blanket, jumping at every sound, every creak of the house. The phone didn't ring again, but I kept waiting for it to. I kept waiting for that voice to return. It never did. But every time I hear a phone ring now, no matter where I am, I can't shake the fear that it's them, that it's the voice calling for help, telling me that someone is coming, the vanishing hitchhiker. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind that makes you question why you ever left home in the first place. I was driving down a lonely stretch of highway, the wind-chilled wipers doing little to clear the relentless downpour. The radio crackled with static, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on the car, swallowing the dim light of the headlights. I was tired, too tired, but I had no choice but to keep going. I had to make it home tonight. The idea of pulling over in this weather, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't appealing, so I kept driving, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other fiddling with the useless radio. That's when I saw her. A woman, standing on the side of the road, drenched from head to toe, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was shivering, her dark hair plastered to her face, and she looked desperate. The sight of her there, alone in the storm, sent a pang of guilt through me. No one should be out in weather like this. I hesitated for a moment, my foot hovering over the brake. I didn't usually pick up hitchhikers, especially not at night, but something about her seemed different. She wasn't a threat, just someone in need. Against my better judgment, I pulled over, rolling down the passenger side window just a crack. "Need a ride?" I called out over the sound of the rain. She hesitated, her wide eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I thought she might say no, but then she nodded, shivering violently as she approached the car. I unlocked the door, and she climbed in, immediately huddling into the seat, her teeth chattering. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible over the storm. I didn't think anyone would stop. "No problem," I said, forcing a smile, though my nerves were starting to get the better of me. "Where are you headed?" Just down the road," she says. "Aid," her voice shaky. Not far. I nodded and started driving again. The silence between us thick and heavy. The rain drummed against the roof of the car, and the wipers squeaked rhythmically as they swept across the windshield. I stole a glance at her from the corner of my eye. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her clothes were soaking wet, clinging to her slender frame. Her hands were trembling in her lap, and her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, as if she was too scared to look anywhere else. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the tension. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear her. "I'm just cold." I nodded, feeling awkward. "I can turn up the heat." I adjusted the dial, though it felt like the warmth wasn't enough to melt the chill in the car. The silence stretched on, the storm outside howling louder, the wind shaking the car as we continued down the empty highway. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally pointed to a small, barely visible turnoff just ahead. "You can drop me off there." I frowned. The road she was pointing to wasn't really a road, more like a narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees. There were no streetlights, no houses, nothing to suggest anyone lived down that way. "Are you sure?" I asked, slowing the car. "It doesn't look like." "I'm sure," she interrupted, her voice sharp, almost panicked. "Please, just let me out here." I hesitated but pulled over to the side of the road. The rain was coming down even harder now, the wind whipping through the trees, making them bend and sway. The woman fumbled with the door handle, clearly in a hurry to get out. "Wait," I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Are you going to be okay out here? Do you live nearby?" She paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the door. When she turned to face me, her expression was strange, almost sad. "I'll be fine," she said softly. "Thank you for the ride." Before I could say anything else, she stepped out of the car and disappeared into the rain, her figure swallowed by the darkness. I sat there for a few moments, staring at the spot where she had vanished. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, like there was more to her story that I didn't understand, but I couldn't exactly follow her. I didn't know where she had gone or why she had been out in the storm in the first place. Finally, I shook my head and pulled back onto the road, trying to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind. The rest of the drive was quiet, the storm gradually dying down as I got closer to home. It wasn't until the next day, when I told a friend about the woman I had picked up, that I realized just how strange the whole thing had been. "There's nothing down that road," my friend said, frowning. "No houses, no cabins, just the old cemetery." A cold chill ran down my spine. The cemetery. Yeah, it's been abandoned for years. No one goes out there anymore. I stared at him, my heart pounding. That couldn't be right. The woman I had picked up wasn't a ghost. She couldn't have been. She was real. I had seen her, spoken to her. I had felt the cold in her skin. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her, something I hadn't wanted to admit at the time. And every time I drove down that stretch of highway after that, I kept expecting to see her again, standing on the side of the road, waiting for another ride. The room with no view. I had been searching for an affordable apartment for weeks, scrolling through endless listings, each more disappointing than the last. Either they were too expensive, too small, or in neighborhoods I wouldn't want to walk through after dark. But then, one day, I came across a listing that seemed too good to be true. Spacious one-bedroom apartment, fully furnished, utilities included, prime location. And the rent, a fraction of what the other places were asking. I was skeptical at first. When something sounds too good to be true, it usually is, but I decided to check it out. The address was in a decent part of town, and the photos on the listing made the place look clean and well kept. I couldn't see any reason not to at least take a look. The building was old, a little worn down around the edges, but not terrible. The landlord, a short, graying man named Mr. Dawes, met me at the front door, his smile wide and welcoming. He led me up a narrow staircase to the third floor, chatting the whole way about the neighborhood and how quiet the building was. When we reached the apartment, Mr. Dawes unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting me take in the space. It was small, but not cramped. The living room was cozy, with an old leather couch and a bookshelf against one wall. The kitchen was tiny, but functional. The bedroom, however, was the part that caught my attention. It was almost perfect except for one thing. There was no window. I stood there for a moment, staring at the blank wall where a window should have been. It was strange, unsettling. Every bedroom should have a window, right? Some kind of view, even if it was just at the alley or the building next door. Isn't it against code to not have a window in the bedroom? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mr. Dawes chuckled, waving off my concern. I get that question a lot. The building's old, grandfathered and under the old rules. Nothing to worry about. I wasn't so sure, but the rest of the apartment was nice, and the price was unbeatable. Plus, it was temporary, just a few months until I could find something better. So, against my better judgment, I signed the lease. The first few days in the apartment were uneventful. The place was quiet, just like Mr. Dawes had promised. The neighbors kept to themselves, and I didn't hear a peep from anyone else in the building. But there was something about that bedroom, something about the lack of a window that made me uneasy. Every night, as I lay in bed, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. The air felt stale, heavy, like it wasn't circulating properly. And in the darkness, the room felt too small, too tight, like I was trapped in a box. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching sound like nails scraping against the wall. I thought it was mice or maybe the pipes in the walls, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It always started in the middle of the night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. The scratching would begin, soft at first, then louder, like it was moving closer, coming from right behind the wall where the window should have been. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a branch scraping against the side of the building. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a random noise. It was coming from inside the wall. One night, after another round of sleep, plus hours listening to the sound, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stood in front of the wall, pressing my ear against it, trying to pinpoint the source of the scratching. It was faint, but it was there right on the other side of the wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I tapped the wall lightly, just to see if anything would happen. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening, and then, from behind the wall, I heard a voice. Let me out. I jumped back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I stared at the wall, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just heard what I thought I had. But the voice came again, louder this time. Let me out. My blood ran cold. There was no one else in the apartment. No one could be behind that wall. It didn't make sense. But the voice kept coming, over and over, pleading, desperate. Let me out. Please, let me out. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone, ready to call the police or the landlord or anyone who could help. But then the voice stopped. The scratching stopped. The room fell silent. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the noise to start again, but it didn't. The apartment was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I packed my things and left the apartment without looking back. I didn't tell Mr. Dawes why I was leaving, and I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted out of that place. Whatever was behind that wall, whatever was scratching, begging to be let out, it wasn't human. The late night delivery. I've been a pizza delivery driver for a couple of years now, and it's mostly uneventful work. People tip well enough, and the hours give me some breathing room during the day. But there was one night, just one, that still sticks with me. I don't usually get rattled by much, but what happened on that delivery, it's something I'll never forget. It was a Friday night, and things were busier than usual. The orders were flying in, and the traffic wasn't helping. My boss was rushing us to get everything out as fast as possible. The night was a blur of addresses, honking horns, and grabbing pizza boxes. By the time it was nearing 11 p.m., I was ready to be done. Then came the last order of the night, a single large pizza to an address I didn't recognize. I punched it into my GPS and realized why. It was way out of town, almost 30 minutes away. I groaned, but what could I do? It was my job, and the tip might be decent given the distance. I grabbed the pizza, hopped in the car, and followed the winding road out of town. After about 20 minutes, the streetlights disappeared, and I was left with just the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. The road became narrower, lined with thick trees that seemed to press in closer the further I drove. Eventually, the GPS told me to turn down a dirt road. I hesitated for a second, glancing around. It didn't look like there were any houses out here, but the address was right. With a sigh, I made the turn. The dirt road was rough, and the rain earlier that day had left deep puddles that splashed against my tires. As I drove, the feeling of isolation grew stronger. It was just me, the dark woods, and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. My phone's reception dropped to nothing. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the house. It was an old, two-story farmhouse sitting at the end of the dirt road. The windows were dark, and there were no lights on outside. The place looked abandoned, but this was the address. I pulled up, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. Something about it made my skin crawl. I grabbed the pizza and got out of the car, walking toward the front door. The air was cold, and the night felt unnaturally quiet. No animals, no wind, just silence. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty night. No answer. Answer. I knocked again, harder this time, listening for any movement inside. Still nothing. My hand hovered over the door, debating whether to knock again or just leave. But before I could decide, the door creaked open just a crack. There was no one there. I peered inside, squinting into the darkness. Hello? Pizza delivery. Silence. The door slowly opened wider, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched into the house. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. There was no furniture, no pictures, nothing to suggest anyone actually lived here. Hello, I called again, my voice shaky. That's when I heard a faint voice, coming from deeper inside the house. Come in. In. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was low, raspy, and unnatural, like it didn't belong to a person. It sent a chill down my spine. I've got your pizza, I said, not moving from the doorway. Can you come to the door? There was no response. Just the same eerie silence. My gut told me to leave. Everything about this felt wrong, but I didn't want to go back empty-handed. I took a step forward, peering into the hallway. The light inside was dim, flickering slightly, casting long shadows on the walls. The smell of something damp and musty filled the air, making my stomach turn. Just leave it on the table, the voice called again, this time louder but no closer. I swallowed hard. Where? Inside. The word echoed down the hall, and my pulse quickened. I stepped back, glancing at my car, which suddenly felt much farther away than it had a minute ago. I could still feel the weight of the silence pressing in, like the house itself was waiting for me to make a decision. No, thanks, I muttered, backing away from the door. I'll leave it here. I set the pizza down on the doorstep and turned on my heel, practically running back to the car. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the house just as I reached the car door. The front door was wide open now. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure tall and shadowy, its face hidden in the dark. It didn't move, didn't say anything. It just stood there, watching. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. My heart was racing the entire drive back, my mind spinning. What had I just seen? Who or what was in that house? I don't know if it was some elaborate prank or something more sinister, but I never took a delivery out there again. The mirror in room 403. When I checked into the hotel, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. It was a last-minute booking, an overnight stay before a business conference. The hotel was an old one, the kind with faded wallpaper and creaky floors, but it was cheap, and I didn't need anything fancy. The receptionist gave me a tired smile as she handed me the key. Room 403, she said, sliding the key across the desk. End of the hall, on the left. I nodded and made my way up the creaky elevator, my suitcase in tow. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and something old, like the scent of a house that hadn't been lived in for years. The carpet under my feet was worn, and the lights overhead flickered occasionally. When I reached room 403, I paused for a second. The door looked like all the others, but there was something about the way the brass numbers gleamed in the dim light that made me feel uneasy. Shaking off the feeling, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small, just a bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. Everything was clean, if a little outdated. The bedspread was a dull floral pattern, and the wallpaper was peeling in one corner. It wasn't anything special, but it would do for one night. As I set my suitcase down, I noticed the mirror. It was large, nearly the size of the entire wall, and it hung directly across from the bed. The frame was ornate, old-fashioned, like something you'd find in a Victorian house. The glass was clean, almost too clean, reflecting the room with eerie precision. I don't know why, but something about the mirror unsettled me. Maybe it was its size or the way it seemed to dominate the room, but I felt like it was watching me. I turned away, trying to ignore it. I spent the rest of the evening going over notes for the next day's conference, trying to focus on work. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of the mirror out of the corner of my eye. It seemed too still, too perfect, like the reflection wasn't quite right. When it was finally time for bed, I crawled under the covers and switched off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the streetlights outside, casting a dim illumination through the thin curtains. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had settled over me. The mirror was just a mirror, I told myself, nothing more. I was being ridiculous. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me from the darkness. I rolled over, turning my back to the mirror, and squeezed my eyes shut. Sleep came slowly, but eventually, exhaustion won out. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The room was pitch black, the faint light from outside no longer visible. At first, I thought the curtains had shifted, blocking out the light, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was wrong. I could see my reflection in the mirror, but the room was dark. There was no light, no way for the mirror to reflect anything. And yet, there it was, my reflection, clear as day, lying in the bed just like me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror didn't move, didn't blink. It just lay there staring up at the ceiling, exactly like I was. Except, it wasn't me. It couldn't be. My reflection was too still, too perfect, like it wasn't just a reflection, but something else entirely. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow, and turned to face the mirror. My reflection didn't move. It stayed there, lying in the bed, staring up at the ceiling, completely motionless. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't my imagination. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the light switch. When the lamp flickered on, I turned back to the mirror. The reflection was gone. There was nothing but the empty bed, the room exactly as it should be. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the mirror, my heart pounding in my ears. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the mirror from across the room, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The reflection never returned, and when morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left without looking back. I never reported what I saw. I didn't think anyone would believe me, but I know what I saw that night, and I'll never stay in room 403 again. The haunting at the lake house. The lake house had been in my family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. It sat on the edge of a quiet, serene lake, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to close off the world beyond. Growing up, I had spent countless summers there, swimming in the cool water, fishing off the dock, and enjoying campfires with my cousins. But as the years went by, We visited less often, and eventually the house fell into disuse. After my grandfather passed away, the lake house was left to me. I hadn't been there in years, but I decided it was time to return to clean it up and see if the place was still in good condition. I thought it might be a nice getaway, a place to escape from the pressures of life. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line. The house looked much the same as I remembered, though it was clearly showing its age. The paint was peeling, and the porch creaked underfoot as I stepped onto it. Still, it had a certain charm, a reminder of simpler times. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of wood and lake air. The furniture was covered in sheets, dust clinging to every surface, but otherwise the place was intact. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning, opening windows to let in the fresh air, and unpacking the supplies I had brought with me. By the time the sun had set, I was exhausted but satisfied with the progress. That night, as I sat on the porch, staring out at the lake, the water perfectly still under the moonlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house had always been quiet, but now it felt too quiet. The usual sounds of crickets, frogs, and rustling leaves were absent, leaving only an eerie silence in their place. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had been years since I'd been here, and I wasn't used to the solitude anymore. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. Eventually, I went inside and locked the doors, double-checking each one before heading to bed. The bedroom was the same as I remembered, simple, with an old wooden bed frame and a small window overlooking the lake. I crawled under the covers, hoping that sleep would come quickly, but it didn't. I lay there in the dark, listening. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses often do, but there was something about the sounds that made me uneasy. It wasn't just the usual settling of the wood, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak, every groan felt deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the house. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, shuffling, like someone was walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart began to race, and I strained to hear more, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving me in silence once again. I told myself it was nothing. Just the house, just the wind. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. But the next morning, I found something that made my heart stop. In the dust on the floor of the living room, just in front of the fireplace, were footprints clear, distinct footprints that hadn't been there the night before. They weren't mine. The prints were too large, the shape unfamiliar, and they weren't just random. They led directly to the fireplace, then stopped. I stood there, staring at the prints, my mind racing. Had someone been in the house? But all the doors were still locked, the windows shut. There was no sign of forced entry. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that I must have tracked in the dirt without realizing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I knew those footprints weren't mine. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the feeling of unease never left me. Every time I walked through the house, I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me, just out of sight. That night, the footsteps returned. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of shuffling feet, moving slowly through the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening. The footsteps were soft but unmistakable, moving from the living room toward the hallway, growing closer and closer. I held my breath, terrified of what might happen next. Then, just as the footsteps reached the door to my bedroom, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay there frozen in bed, my heart racing, waiting for the door to creak open, for something to come inside, but nothing happened. The house was still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, too scared to move. The next morning, I found the footprints again. This time, they were in the hallway, leading to my bedroom door. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my things and left the lake house, not caring that I hadn't finished cleaning, not caring about anything except getting away from that place. I haven't been back since. The silent neighbor. I'd only been living in the apartment building for a few weeks when I first noticed the woman next door. She wasn't like the other neighbors, no cheerful greetings in the hallway, no friendly small talk in the elevator. In fact, I had never heard her say a word. Her apartment was right next to mine, and we shared a wall, but no sound ever came from her side. No footsteps, no music, no voices, nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just quiet, kept to herself. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I began noticing her at odd hours, coming and going without making a sound. She always moved silently, her footsteps barely a whisper on the carpeted floors. She never carried groceries, never had visitors, just in and out, her movements smooth and deliberate, like she was floating rather than walking. One night, as I was coming home from work, I saw her standing in the hallway. She was staring at her door, her hand resting on the doorknob, but she wasn't going inside. She just stood there, unmoving, her back to me. "Hey," I said, giving her a small wave as I passed by. "How's it going?" She didn't respond. I paused, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, but she didn't turn around. She didn't move at all. It was as if she hadn't heard me, even though I was standing just a few feet away. Feeling a little unnerved, I unlocked my door and went inside, but the encounter stayed with me. Something about the way she had stood there, so still, so silent, gave me the creeps. Over the next few days, I kept an eye out for her. She always seemed to be around, but never at the same time of day. Sometimes I'd see her leaving the building early in the morning, other times she'd return late at night. But no matter when I saw her, she never spoke, never smiled, never even glanced in my direction. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something, finally a sound coming from her apartment. It was faint, barely audible through the thin walls, but it was there. A low, rhythmic tapping. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone tapping their fingers against a hard surface. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and it sent a chill down my spine. I stood there, listening for what felt like an eternity, but the tapping never changed. It just kept going, over and over in the same pattern, with the same intensity. I tried knocking on the wall, hoping to get her attention, but the tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. I backed away from the wall, my heart racing. Something about the sound felt wrong, unnatural. I had never heard her make any noise before, and now this eerie, unrelenting tapping was all I could hear. I tried to ignore it, crawling into bed and pulling the covers over my head, but the sound followed me. It felt like it was inside my head, like it was tapping against my skull, demanding my attention. Sleep didn't come that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the endless tapping. The next morning, I decided to confront her. I knocked on her door, waiting for her to answer, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any movement inside, but the apartment was silent. No tapping, no footsteps, nothing. I don't know why, but something in me snapped. I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty apartment. The furniture was sparse, just a couch and a table with nothing on the walls, no personal belongings in sight. The air was thick with dust, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No answer. I walked through the apartment, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The bedroom was just as empty as the living room. No bed, no clothes, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. I stood there, staring at the bare walls, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it. The tapping. Unpulsing. It was coming from behind me, from the hallway, growing louder, more insistent. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just like the rest of the apartment. I backed out of the apartment, my heart racing, and closed the door behind me. The tapping stopped as soon as the door clicked shut, leaving me in eerie silence once again. I never saw the woman again after that. It's been months since that night, and the apartment next to mine is still empty, but every now and then, late at night, I hear the faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side of the wall. And I know she's still there. The man in the woods. Camping had always been my way of unplugging from the world. There was nothing quite like the solitude of the wilderness, no traffic, no cell service, just the sound of birds and the rustling of trees. So when I found a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles from any trail or other campers, I thought it would be the perfect getaway. The first day went by peacefully. I set up my tent by a small stream, collected firewood, and cooked dinner over the open flame. As the sun set behind the treetops, I sat by the fire, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. It was serene, exactly what I had been hoping for. The first sign that something was off came just before midnight. I had settled into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the cool night air, when I heard a soft, distant rustling in the trees. At first, I brushed it off. Animals roamed the woods at night, and the sound of leaves or branches moving wasn't unusual. But as the rustling continued, it grew louder, closer, until it sounded like something or someone was moving through the trees just outside my campsite. I sat up in my tent, listening carefully. My heart began to race as I strained to hear more. The rustling stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the night. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a deer or a raccoon, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke to a clear, bright day. I shook off the unease from the night before and spent the day hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and the isolation. By the time I returned to camp that evening, I had almost forgotten about the strange noises. But that night, as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, I heard it again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just rustling in the trees, it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The trees cast long, ominous shadows, and the light barely pierced the dense foliage. I called out, hoping that it was just another camper who had wandered too close. No response. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel the presence of someone just out of sight, watching me. I stood there for a few more moments, my heart racing, before retreating back into the tent, zipping it up tightly. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt and patches of grass, were footprints, large human footprints. They circled the tent, leading in and out of the trees. I stood there staring at the prints, my mind racing. There was no one else out here, at least no one I had seen. And the prints were fresh, too fresh. Someone had been there, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I quickly packed up my things, throwing everything haphazardly into my backpack. My plan had been to stay another night, but there was no way I was sticking around after what I had found. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever had been out there last night was still nearby, waiting. As I made my way back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the forest was eerily quiet, too quiet, and the sense of being followed never left me. It wasn't until I reached my car and drove away that the feeling of dread began to lift. I haven't been camping alone since. The diner at the edge of town. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to go wrong. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long day of meetings, but between the traffic and the endless detours, I had gotten completely lost. My GPS wasn't picking up any signal, and I was running on fumes. I needed to stop somewhere, anywhere. That's when I saw it, a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was the only sign of life I had seen in miles, so I didn't think twice about pulling into the gravel parking lot. The place looked worn down, its windows clouded with age, but the lights were on, and I could smell the faint aroma of food in the air. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. The diner was empty, save for a man behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. He looked up as I walked in, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, his voice gruff. "What can I get ya?" I slid into a booth near the window, glancing around. The place had an old-fashioned charm, with red vinyl booths and checkered floors, but something about it felt off. There were no other customers, no music playing, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Just coffee, thanks," I said, feeling too tired to eat. The man nodded and disappeared behind the counter, leaving me alone in the eerie silence. I stared out the window, but there was nothing to see, just the empty road and the dark stretch of land beyond. No other cars, no buildings, just the diner sitting there like a forgotten relic. After a few minutes, the man brought over a steaming cup of coffee and set it down in front of me. I thanked him, but he didn't say anything, just turned and walked back to the counter, where he resumed his task of wiping it down over and over. I took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, bitter, but it warmed me up. I glanced around the diner again, taking in the details I hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with old photos, black and white, faded from years of neglect. They showed groups of people, families, friends standing in front of the diner, smiling, laughing. But the more I looked, the more unsettling the photos became. There was something wrong with the people in the pictures. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too dark. In every photo, there was something slightly off about their expressions, like they were pretending to be happy, like they were posing for something they didn't want to be a part of. I felt a chill crawl down my spine and turned my attention back to my coffee, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. But as I sat there, the sense of unease only grew. The man behind the counter hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring down at the counter, wiping the same spot over and over again. The air in the diner felt heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on me. I glanced toward the kitchen door, half expecting someone else to come out, but it remained closed. There was no sound of cooking, no clattering of dishes, nothing. Just the low hum of the lights and the faint sound of the man's rag moving across the counter. I took another sip of coffee, but it tasted different now, metallic, almost. I set the cup down, my stomach turning, and stood up to leave. "I think I'm gonna head out," I said, pulling out my wallet. "How much do I owe you?" The man didn't look up. He just kept wiping the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. "No charge," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You sure?" He didn't respond, just continued wiping, over and over. I left a few bills on the table anyway, and hurried toward the door. The bell jingled as I pushed it open, and I stepped out into the cool night air, relieved to be out of that place. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder at the diner. Through the window, I could see the man still standing behind the counter, wiping the same spot, his hands down, his face hidden in the shadows. I got into my car and drove away, my heart pounding in my chest. The road was dark, empty, and as I glanced at the rearview mirror, I expected to see the diner fading into the distance. But when I looked, it was gone. There was nothing there. No diner, no neon sign, just the empty road stretching behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town.